Good evening, and welcome to Vulture's Rainbow Theatre. I am your host, Damon Vulture, and tonight I shall be reading a story of my own, inspired by the work of my two favourite authors, H.P. Lovecraft and Clark Ashton Smith, great writers of weird fiction in a bygone age. And now, in all its lurid detail and turgid prose, here it is, a little tale that I like to call The White Lady. When the people of Earth grew tired and old with the making of war and history and great works to be left for posterity, I lived by the sea. Having great wealth, I could well afford my old colonial New England home with its parapets, its gables, its widow's walk over the front door. My house was grouped with many others into a kind of sleepy village which gathered at the beachfront and gently ascended the rolling hills behind. There were quaint wooden docks and quaint boats with masts and furled sails, seldom used pleasure boats of the bored citizenry. From the village, which faced the east and the sea, the sandy coastline curved north to the horizon and continued on yet again south until it faded from sight. In that latter direction, when the weather was especially clear, one might see, ever so faint and grey, the raggedly subsiding towers of an ancient port city. Travellers which came up occasionally from that way said that it was silent now, as with the sombre stillness of the marble crypt, a sprawling tomb of towering remains. The earth was in those days filled with the colour of death. It is not that its seas had become sluggish, nor that its sun was burning cold, nor that the earth slowed in its orbit about the sun. The problem was with humankind, so tired, so ready to be done with existence. It was humanity whose own collective perceptions of the futility of life, who filled the world with the colour of death. We toiled little, and let our advanced technology hum along amid the long dead towers of the past, keeping up the appearance of life. But in our souls we were cold and grey and restless. If in some past year a cool day of March had blown a half-hopeful, sensuous breeze into my arid soul, now I was old and burdened with a never-ending stream of time. In my house I gazed out often on the endless sea, and as my years began to multiply toward death, I gazed longer. I would stand on the widow's walk over the front door in the silver night when the moon was high and all the sea was glittering below. Nights were I'd stand there till the fires of the dawn and the passing of the silent stars. Always and more often I hoped, though what it was I hoped for I could not say. One evening, when the tiny village lay in purple shadow, I stood on the walk above my door, looking out as was my habit, and it seemed to me that something was coming through the air, coming from across the sea. At last, when it was near, I saw that it was a woman the colour of new ivory, and dressed in white robes. She hailed me gravely with uplifted hand. Her eyes were like a still pool of water in the garden of a god. I saw that she was beautiful, and that her eyes were possessed of a violet hue, of an inviting and hypnotic depth. and it seemed to me that I had never known such music as that which came from her, and from within me. After a time she went back, retracing her steps, but as her ivory form hovered over the edge of the sea, she turned again for a moment as if to say, "Follow me." A curious thing happened. She became a slender line of light pointing upward toward a particular star, and then she was gone. Though I looked for her on successive evenings, she did not return. Nevertheless, I saw her eyes in my dreams, and these whispered, "Follow me." As I said, I was fairly well-to-do as people went in that age, and I could afford the things I might desire. It had occurred to me that the White Lady most likely had gone to a planet of that star. Space travel being commonplace, I could reasonably hope to look for her there, provided I could afford the transportation. And I could. Technology was such in those days that the shape and construction of a craft was almost unimportant. I knew a man who had installed silent but powerful drive engines in his old pillared Georgian home. Shortly he was gone. Had he been restless as I was, or had he simply chosen to take his colossal boredom into space with him? At any rate, I had money and contracted to have a ship built. The shape I chose for my vessel was one which came from my library of ancient history. The ship, when finished, looked rather like the rarely used pleasure boats at anchor, complete with masts and sails. But mine was much bigger, a 4-masted clipper, with a long hull and a graceful sweep. All ivory she was, like the mysterious lady, with great billowing sails as white as the lady's robes. She was designed to sail the seas of earth and move with grace and speed through the gulfs of space. It was with this ship that I proposed to follow the nameless woman. During the days of her building, I went out to neighboring villages looking for experienced space crewmen and asking about the star. No man of space had been there, and in those tired last days of human existence it was difficult to find adventurous hearts willing to undertake so uncertain a voyage. As I went about these duties and waited for my ship's completion, the woman's face and form began to dominate my thoughts. And now especially I saw her eyes, like pools of still water in the garden of a god. And those said, as always, "Follow me." At last the ship was done, her engines proved, her every piece inspected for the voyage. The crew, which would be quite at home with the drive engines in space, now moved awkwardly about the decks, each man using his hasty and just adequate sea training to unfurl the antique sails. My desire, perhaps a silly and romantic one, was to sail into the east at sunset upon the water, until the village should disappear below the waves, and then to lift off toward the stars. The lines were undone and reeled in with the help of neighbors on the wharf. Silent boats pulled us out into the deeper waters, and the west wind came up and filled our sails. In this way we began to glide east across the sea, until the lighted hills behind us fell below the horizon. With the rising of the moon we lifted off into the sky, and set our course for the star and the lady. It is difficult to recall the things we encountered on our long voyage. Every world is as different as every man, and as the same as every man. There were worlds at peace and at war, great and tiny worlds, peculiar worlds, and worlds which seemed rather commonplace. But everywhere I looked I saw only the frenetic activity which seemed to me to be the peculiar fate of humankind. frenetic activity ending in dust. Whether men did good or ill, whether a world was good or evil, they lived till they died, and they were dying every day. These thoughts made me sad and tired, but then I would see the lady again in my mind, especially her eyes, which were like pools of still water in the garden of a god, and these seemed to say, "Follow me." We arrived in the vicinity of the star while I slept in my cabin. A gentle touch from the steward brought me up from sleep. "We are here," he whispered, and was gone. I rose and put on my garments. When I emerged on deck, I blinked in the brilliant light of the lady's star for a moment and called to the mate. Respectfully, for he knew me to be a man of some wealth, he spoke concerning the planets of this sun. Most were uninhabitable. There were, however, 2 of those worlds which deserved some consideration. One was green and beautiful, but there was no indication of humans living on its surface. Another was dry and cruel, but its air was breathable, and the ship's instruments indicated the presence of a living human being. It was agreed that we should go to that place, landing as near as we dared to the only area of habitation our instruments could show us. We landed in a part of that world where it was, I guessed, about midday. My ship hovered low above a desert of red dust, which ran in nearly every direction as far as the eye could see, with the exception that to the east of our ship rose high, dark pinnacles of rock worn into fantastic shapes by the wind, the occasional rain, the never-ending dust. Toward this I determined to make my way, taking with me only my steward. The mate protested that a bigger party must go, and though I listened patiently, I was insistent that only the steward should go with me. I had no desire that my lady should be exposed to the view of common sailors. So it came to pass that with my steward I made ready to set off across the red desert. We put on bright robes of heavy cloth to keep the sun from our bodies, and turbans for our heads. On our backs we carried items for a journey of 2 days. Should we fail to return in 2 settings of the sun, the mate would then assume command of the ship and attempt either to find us or to leave the planet and return home. Having gotten all in order, I climbed with my steward down a spindly rope ladder to the desert floor. I would be wasting words to relate in detail that monotonous journey through an oblivion of blowing dust and warm air. I will only say that in the cool of late afternoon before sunset, we came to the foot of those strange pinnacles. So steep were they that it seemed almost that they rose abruptly from the desert floor. To our disappointment, they presented a continuous, though not smooth, face without fissure or crack. I was certain that the lady would be found beyond this barrier. Thus minded, we stood for a long time studying the cyclopean walls for any means of entry. After a time, the steward gripped my arm and pointed. Beyond the end of his finger I could see the cliff face with its twisting, irregular grooves. But at one point of the base there was indeed the appearance of an arched door, closed or sealed. We went to this, being careful not to take our eyes away, for the door was hardly distinguishable from the rest of the face and could be easily lost. At last we were directly before the giant portal. We discovered soon that although it was of great size and weight, it yielded easily to the pressure, swinging inward into a kind of subterranean night. We hesitated a moment or 2, trying without success to see into the darkness. There was nothing to do but go forward or quit the whole endeavour now. On an impulse, I dismissed the steward, ordering him to return to the ship at once. This he did only after much protest. As he turned to go, I entered into the cool darkness. The sound of the steward's footsteps diminished steadily until it was altogether indistinguishable from the low wind outside. Using a small electric light from my pack, I edged forward, letting the beam sweep the floor until I was certain there were no pits or other dangers. Satisfied with that aspect of my search, I shined the light directly upward. The beam was lost in the darkness, indicating to me that the ceiling must be many hundreds of feet above. Sweeping about with the light, I saw 2 stairways directly ahead, side by side. Standing on the edge of the one to the left, I saw that its glowing nitered steps descended downward into darkness. The other staircase, on the right, climbed steadily upward from some unguessed distance. This, I whispered to myself, could be the palace of a god or goddess. With that, I chose the upward way, unable to believe that my lady, who had come to see me in the air, would be found somewhere down at the bottom of that interminable downward stair. The ascent in darkness produced a curious sensation. I climbed stair upon stair without the sense of progress. My only signs in that unbroken night were the occasional abrupt turns. I realized that I was climbing an immense spiral of ascending steps. These seemed to go on endlessly, for I climbed to the point of exhaustion, and still there was no respite. Fatigue brought me down in the Stygian night of that alien tower, and I slept. It was then that some delicate fragrance came to my attention. Perhaps it had been there long, and I had not smelled it until now. There was something about it of verdance, of giant tropical blossoms in feverish scarlet jungles, of limitless fields of spring grasses starred with strange, narcotic blossoms. And there was, so faintly, that perfume which had come to me across the sea, when the milky arms had beckoned, and I had looked into those eyes, like pools of still water in the garden of a god. And those eyes said to me again, as they had said before, "Follow me." Following that hint of cinnamon and of teak, of jasmine and of orange, I came at last to a door which I could feel with my hands, but could not see. My fingers told me that the door was gorgeous with strange carvings, convoluted and unspeakably intricate. I pushed this open, and there, of a sudden, was the naked alien sky. Now in place of red desert was indeed the garden of a god, contained high within the walls of that tower mountain which I had entered and climbed. There were groves of little trees, lush with peculiar fruit, and leaves the color of carved jade. There were little paths lined with disturbingly alien blossoms of abnormal shape and size, of breathless, prismatic color. There was the sound of water flowing, bubbling, trickling. Toward this fresh sound I made my way, following in wonder the labyrinthine paths which wound among the sights of that ultra-telluric garden. I went past grotesquely pagan figurines and sculptures, past cages filled with gorgeous birds hung from the trees, past little quiet pentagonal shrines with pagoda roofs, past bloated scarlet stands of fungi, half hidden in the inner recesses of the tropic verdure. At last, a mighty fountain of numberless pumes of spray, caught in sunlight, loomed before me. And in the midst of this I saw her who had drawn me across the dreamless gulfs of interstellar space. She was just as I had seen her from my balcony, hopeless light years distant from this planet. She was all white and ivory and lovely. And most especially, I looked again at last into those eyes like pools of still water in the garden of a god. And those eyes said, welcome. I cannot now call forth such words as might have been suitable to describe the delight that followed. There was the silent, respectful approach to the fountain, the regal descent of the White Lady, the touching of our fingertips. There were words and smiles which I cannot now recall, but yet somehow remember, though neither in words nor images. I do remember that we stayed together in that garden while the centuries wheeled silently past. I knew my ship had long ago gone its way, though I never saw it lift off from the desert floor, never saw its white sails and spars half hidden in the clouds as it drifted off into the stars. I do not know how long I remained in that strange garden, for each day was an opiate fever in which time came to be as motionless as the idols of the groves. I do know that at last I came to be weary of the place and wanted only to go home to my house beside the sea. The lady, knowing me so well, knew that I loved her, but she also knew this. And though she had hoped that I might stay as long as the scarlet birds would sing in their cages and the sun might make its circuit of the sky, she did at last accept what she read in my moods and words. It occurred to me then that the house, after all the long centuries of my absence, would be gone. The earth that I had known would have changed beyond recognition. At this I grew despondent and told all my sadness to the lady. She shared my concerns and thought on the matter for 7 starlit nights. And after the 7 nights had passed, and the morning of the 8th day had come, she touched my shoulder where I lay sleeping on a bed of emerald leaves in the groves of alien fruit, and said, "There is a door." Taking my hand, she led me through a series of confusing passageways, through exotic purple hedges. We came before too long to a part of that mountainous wall which hid the little paradise. There was a door in the stone, a very simple door with a great bronze ring. I opened it and saw dimly phosphorescent stairs going down into darkness. "Your ship did not return to Earth," the lady said, "even if you had left this place to go back to your house beside the sea. You would have been lost with your crew in the storms of Jupiter. I have had a double joy with you, for I have had your company, and have now saved your life. Now behold this stair, for it is not like any stair, being made to traverse time as well as space. Perhaps you will find your way home this way. I send you with a blessing." More words were shared, more touches, more gazes, but the time was come to leave. She led me gently to the open portal, touching my cheek with a white hand. I turned and began my descent. The door closed, and instead of the tropical dream in which I had lived so long, there was only darkness and the sickly green illumination of the nitered steps. The further I walked, the cooler the air became, till it was finally quite cold. I discovered that this was not at all unpleasant, because my thoughts, so long lost in that opiate fever, now became clear and buoyant. The weight of ages seemed to drop away from me, as though the folds of my robes had before been filled with gold and spices, and now were empty. It was nearly sunset when I emerged from the mouth of a cave on Earth. I found myself looking down from a lofty promontory on a cliff face toward the ocean spread out flat beneath the glowing sky. Below I could see a broad strip of beach, and on a place where the hills rose up as rounded knobs covered with oaks and maples, there lay the houses of my village. I breathed the salt air with a mixture of gratitude and relief. It was then that I noticed a curious thing. There was a beautiful white ship, my ship, in the village harbour. As I watched, small boats began to pull it out toward the open sea. When it had cleared the harbour mouth, the sails unfurled and began to swell with the west wind of evening. The stars were coming out. The white clipper, caught in the light of dying sunset and newly risen moon, glided across the surface of the sea. It suddenly rose, suspended for a moment in the air. It turned and hove through the summer mists toward the stars. I waved to myself in the white ship and went down to live in the house to which I would never return, for I would die in the storms of Jupiter. And even as I sailed through the gulfs of space toward the star of the White Lady, I lived in my house by the sea with the memories of the White Lady, so that now I cannot tell whether it was a dream or no. And my neighbours know no more than I, nor care to. There remains the house, the sea, and the memory of those eyes. The eyes like pools of still water in the garden of a god. And in my memory, those eyes are silent. You have been listening to The White Lady. Don't forget to check our Vulture's Rainbow business page on Facebook to learn future dates and locations of Vulture's Rainbow, your mobile home for dark art. This is Damon Vulture, wishing you a good night and dark dreams.